When one thinks of a tank or armored fighting vehicle, an image of a lumbering beast with a rotatable turret housing a cannon will most likely pop into your mind. While this is undoubtedly the layout of the vast majority of tanks ever made, there's another very similar class of armored fighting vehicle that is often overlooked in favor of the more conventional types. Enter the self-propelled gun. More specifically referred to as an assault gun in this case, these armored vehicles were once a staple of 20th century warfare, but have all but disappeared in the more modern landscape of today. So what is this class of armored vehicle anyways? Well, the first and most obvious difference is the general trend of having no rotatable turret. Instead, the armament is mounted in the superstructure or hull of the vehicle, with little to no independent traverse within its mount. Generally speaking, the vehicle will have to traverse its hull in order to bring the weapon to bear on target. We'll come back to this fact later. Additionally, a prominent identifying feature of assault guns is their unusually low silhouette. This, of course, is caused by the removal of a turret, which allows the profile to be dramatically lowered. But this design trait goes a long way in practice, which we'll also later explore. So without further ado, let's discuss the history of this tank that is not a tank. With the First World War came the dawn of the age of tanks, which at that point were heavy, lumbering things meant to cross trenches and breach the stalemate of the Western Front. The original British Mark 1 to 5 and German A7V tanks did not have turrets. Instead, their cannons were mounted in casemates, much similar to battleships. It wasn't until the Renault Ft Tank in 1917 that the concept of a top-mounted turret that could traverse a full 360 degrees became a reality. Despite the FT's small size, weak armor, and an unimpressive 37mm cannon, the ability to react to enemies at any angle without having to traverse the hull was a monumental advantage that soon became the staple of armored doctrine for every nation interested in tank production. During the interwar period, tank development entered a strange phase. The general trend of designs were tanks made for the trench warfare stalemate of the Great War, with the most extreme examples being the so-called land ships. These behemoths of the battlefield had multiple turrets, a huge silhouette, and a long chassis meant to cross trenches with ease. However, these projects were only undertaken by richer nations who had the coin and resources to fund these outlandish endeavors. Turrets, despite their undeniable advantages, proved costly in the modules such as the motors to pivot it and the need to precisely machine the turret ring to function smoothly. Cost and complexity of manufacture, as it seems, would become a variable with much greater gravity in the following conflict to come. With the onset of the Second World War following the German invasion of Poland in 1939 came the use of a vastly different armored doctrine than had been anticipated by pre-war inquiries. The German army used a series of tactics called Bewegungskrieg, but more commonly referred to in pop culture as Blitzkrieg. Bewegungskrieg directly translates to war of movement, which accurately describes the concept behind the doctrine, making heavy use of tanks to support infantry, but primarily as their own autonomous Panzer units. The Poles were overwhelmed by this modernized force that had been preparing for this war for over half a decade. Among these German Panzer units were two main medium tanks, the Panzer III and IV. Both of these tanks were very similar in design, but in practice had opposite roles. The Panzer III had either a 37mm or 50mm anti-tank gun in its turret, capable of penetrating the armor of any armored vehicle Poland could muster. The Panzer IV, in contrast, featured a 75mm low-velocity howitzer, which supported infantry units and almost exclusively fired high-explosive shells against enemy hardpoints such as bunkers or houses. The Panzer IV was not intended to fight enemy tanks, and though it was completely capable of engaging them using high-explosive anti-tank or heat rounds, that role was generally left to the Panzer IIIs. With the fall of Poland and the German tank losses sustained, it was clear that in order not to fall to attrition in the global war to come, the production of armored vehicles would have to be altered to lower costs and hasten the production process. This led to the creation of the infamous Sturmgeschütz, or Stug. Built on the chassis of the Panzer III but without a turret, the Stug mounted the 75mm howitzer found on the Panzer IV with a much lower cost and smaller silhouette. The latter advantage meant that the weight of the Stug was notably lighter than a Panzer III, which was generously spent on thicker armor. During the Battle of France, the Stug proved itself as a capable armored vehicle, and production rates of Stugs skyrocketed as they were 20% cheaper to build and required less complex machinery and raw materials, meaning more production plants could make them. In total, almost twice as many Stugs were made compared to Panzer IIIs over the course of the entire war. With the invasion of the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the Germans encountered many Soviet designs that featured armor that was near impenetrable to the guns mounted on their tanks at the time. The German reaction was to attempt to outgun their armored vehicles, ideally by giving both the Panzer III and IV the high-velocity 75mm KWK-40, though due to the design of the Panzer III's turret, it was unable to house a cannon larger than the long-barreled 50mm KWK-39. This new development put the Panzer III's service life in a precarious position until it was found that the Stug, built on the same chassis, could mount the long 75. The reason for this is that a tank turret needs to be able to withstand the kinetic energy of the gun's recoil without damaging the turret ring or drives, and needs to be able to fit in the turret and still retain room for the turret crew to efficiently operate in. An example of these issues not being properly addressed is in the Soviet KV-2 heavy tank. Featuring a massive 152mm howitzer in an incredibly tall turret, this tank proved to be a cumbersome and unreliable machine. Not only could the tank not traverse the turret on angled terrain due to the weight, but it could even critically damage the turret ring if it fired in any direction to the sides. The German Stug, obviously having no turret and a much lower center of gravity, didn't suffer from either of these issues and proved to be a very reliable and efficient setup for an inexpensive mobile anti-tank platform. The Stug would inspire the further development of many other turretless armored vehicles in both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Seeing the success of the Stug, Soviet High Command began development on the Su series of assault guns, including the Su-122, Su-85, and Su-100, all on the chassis of their T-34 medium tank. On the chassis of their heavy tanks were the Su-152 on the KV chassis, and the ISU-152, ISU-122, and ISU-122S on the IS chassis. Over on the German side, almost every new tank design had a Jagdpanzer or hunting tank variant to go along with it. While these were technically tank destroyers in design, they still generally followed the ideals that made the Stug so successful with a few exceptions. This new generation of turretless armored vehicles included the Jagdpanzer IV and 470, Jagdpanther, Elephant, and the monstrous Jagdtiger. While the first two designs more closely follow the first two broad advantages of the assault gun class, the latter three heavily exploit the third to a point where the practicality is drawn into question. The Jagdpanzer IV was essentially a Stug on the chassis of the Panzer IV, though confusingly those already existed, and the Jagdpanzer 470 was essentially the same thing with thickened armor and the very high-velocity 75mm L70 cannon found on the Panther. Notice how the lack of a turret means the gun on the 470 didn't need a muzzle brake to absorb the recoil like the Panther's does. This is a definite advantage as muzzle brakes cause a large amount of smoke to be dispensed outward in front of the tank, increasing the likelihood that the vehicle will be spotted whilst also disrupting the crew's vision. With the latter three tank destroyers, they all featured a more powerful armament than their turreted counterpart, though the terrible reliability record of the chassis they were built on proved to be very problematic. A defining con of turretless vehicles is the need to traverse the entire hull of the vehicle to react to threats to its sides. This requires the engine to be running, which not only means it will generate noise in a stealth environment, but also means that if the engine fails, the vehicle is essentially disabled. This proved to be fatal to the combat performance of these three tank destroyers, with the Jagdtiger being abandoned more often than it was destroyed by enemy fire. It seemed, as was often the case, that the Germans had gone leagues too far. In the post-war atmosphere, the world of turretless vehicles all but disappeared. The emergence of the main battle tank, a vehicle that could fulfill any role needed by an armored vehicle, essentially proved the tank destroyer and assault gun both obsolete. While there were some attempts to keep the concept alive in designs such as the Foch 50B or Kanonenjagdpanzer, they were mostly dead-end designs that quickly fell to the wayside. That was, until the Stridsvagn 103. This Swedish abomination shocked the tanking world with its outlandish design and lack of a turret or any sort of independent gun traverse at all. However, the Stridsvagn had the power of technology on its side. Featuring hydropneumatic suspension, this STRV-103 could tilt the hull in any direction to aim the gun, and quickly traverse on the spot to track moving targets. The incredibly low silhouette was perfect for Sweden's intended use of its strange main battle tank, defense. With Soviet-influenced Finland right next door, Sweden was very concerned about a communist invasion of the rest of Europe, and planned to use the STRV-103 strictly in a defensive role, being dug in under an entrenchment to protect the engine from being hit and to make full use of the heavily sloped armor. The Stridsvagn was the perfect final evolution of its class, and while it marked the end of the so-called turretless tank, it was a remarkable send-off that served Sweden well by never having to be put to use, as the Soviet invasion never came. And with that comes the conclusion of this presentation. I sincerely hope you learned something new, or just enjoyed the ride through history. And so long for now.